Hi, first graders. Today we're going to take a look at graphs and specifically picture graphs or pictographs. So as we get started, I want you to look here at the graph that's on my screen. I'm going to point a couple of features out to you that you'll need to know in order to look at the data in the graph or read the graph and get information from it. So when we talk about data, what we're looking at is what information does the graph give us. So this specific graph is looking at people's favorite fruits. And we can tell that because up at the top, there is a heading or a title to the graph. That title at the top is like a label that tells us what information this graph is giving us. So this particular pictograph is going to give us information about people's favorite fruits. A couple of other things that you'll need to know is off to the side, it'll have the different labels of what kind of data was collected. So if we're talking about favorite fruits, the choices for this graph were apple or banana. And so in the picture graph, there's usually a little picture that tells you what that represents. And sometimes there's a key that tells you that like one picture equals one vote. So in these, for now, what we'll need to know is that people voted on their favorite fruits, and the choices were apple and banana. So we'll know it's a picture of an apple, and that represents one vote for apple. And then there's a picture of a banana that represents a vote for banana. Now, when we're looking at the data or looking at the pictures, we don't take into account these little pictures that are over here as the label. Those don't count. They're just telling us what the picture represents. So this little red picture represents apple, and this yellow one represents banana. So as we're counting and looking at the information that the graph is giving us, we don't count those when we are looking at the votes. So below the graph, there are some questions. And really, when we have graphs, the point of them is to collect information and put them in an easy way for us to see what information we got as we were collecting that data. And so it really helps us to easily look quickly and be able to answer some questions about the data that we collected. So there's two questions here about this particular graph. And the first one is, which fruit was the least favorite? Now we'll have to remember the difference between least and greatest or most. And we know that least is the smaller amount. So if I'm trying to figure out which is the least favorite, I want to know which one got the fewest amount of votes or the smallest amount of votes. So if I'm looking at the graph, I see that apple got 2 votes. There's 2 apples within the actual graph. And then bananas, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I know that 2 is less than 5. And so I know that apple is the least favorite. Apples are the least favorite in this particular survey or this particular information. Another question that it's asking us on this particular one is how many more people chose bananas than apples? This is going to be a really common question. It's going to ask me either how many more or how many fewer of a certain item in the graph. And we're going to use just like that comparing strategy that we've been doing with the story problems earlier this year. We're really looking at which ones have partners and which ones are left over. So if you think of it that way, like we're doing a story problem, it's just the same. You already just have a graph and a picture ready for you, and it's just one less step that you have to take. So if I'm looking at this graph here, I want to know how many more people chose bananas than apples. So we already know that there's more people that chose bananas. But we want to know how many more. So when I'm looking at the graph, I'm looking at which ones have partners. So these are even. There's 1 and 1 vote. 1 and 1, these have partners. And then these ones here are left over. There's no apples in the graph that's the same amount of vote for bananas. So these 3 right here don't have partners. So that means that 3 more people chose bananas as their favorite than apples. So sometimes there's going to be some other questions when you look at graphs. So let's look at another one and practice again together. So this one, again, the title is Zoo Animals. So we know that this particular graph tells us about the animals that are at the zoo. And so on the side, we have labels of there are penguins, and we know that penguins are represented by this picture here. And there are bears at the zoo. And this is a picture that represents bears. Remember, when we're looking at the data and we're answering questions, we're not going to look at these pictures here down below. We're going to look at the rest of the graph up here. This just tells us what pictures to look for to represent that thing on the graph. So one of the questions that we want to answer about this particular graph is how many bears are at the zoo? So in order to do that, I need to look at the graph and I need to look at the bear section. So the bears, it goes over in a row, and I can count how many pictures of bears there are and know that that's how many bears are there. So how many bears are there? Well, 1, 2, 3. There are 3 bears at the zoo. It says right there in the graph. We just have to count 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now another question, how many more penguins are there than bears? So again, when it's at how many more, I'm going to do that comparing strategy that we've worked on with our story problems. And since we're all pros at that, we know exactly what to do. So thinking about my strategy, the picture's already there for me. All I have to do is look at them and pair them up to see how many extras there are. So I want you to pause the video and take a look at the graph. See if you can figure it out before I do it. All right, now that you've done it on your own, let's see. So we're going to have these be partners. These have a partner. These have a partner, but as I go to this one, there's no bear to be partners with this penguin. So I see that these ones here are left over. They don't have a partner, which means that there are 2 more penguins at the zoo than there are bears. All right, finally, how many animals are at the zoo all together? Now this one seems like it might be a little bit tricky, but it's really not. The data is already there. The information is already there for me on the graph. The important thing to remember is that I do not include these pictures here that go with the key or that tells me what pictures are represented on my graph. So I don't include these ones off to the side as I'm counting for anything that I'm answering questions about on the graph. So now I just have to count, since each of these represent 1 animal at the zoo. I just need to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now we know that there are 8 animals at the zoo total.